Welcome to High Scary Stories. Tonight, we bring you 5 terrifying wilderness tales that were never supposed to be told. Stories of remote cabins, vanishing trails, unseen watchers, and voices that do not belong to this world. If you've ever camped alone, wandered off the map, or felt like something was following you in the trees, these stories might stay with you longer than you expect. This is High Scary Stories. Let's begin. Modern Story 1. The Man Who Knew My Shower Schedule. I took the job because it paid cash and was just far enough off the highway that I figured no one from my old town would stumble in. The sign out front said, "Big Red's BBQ, and the place looked like it had been stapled together from pieces of old barns. Tin roof, faded paint, a hand-painted menu with prices that hadn't changed since the 90s. It sat right off Route 97, where the desert turned into pine scrub, about an hour outside Taos. I'd been crashing with my cousin in his trailer after things went south with my ex, and I needed anything that felt like a clean start. Big Red himself was this massive guy with a voice like gravel and a beard that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. But he paid well. Gave me my own keys to open on weekends, and let me take home leftover ribs. I worked mostly mornings and lunch shifts. Tourists and pickups, road crews, the occasional biker group. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. The hours left my evenings free. The only thing that really bothered me was the quiet. Once the lunch crowd left, the whole place settled into this eerie stillness. No music, no traffic hum, just wind against the side of the shack and the occasional bird throwing itself against the screen door. My rental cabin was about 15 minutes up the ridge, tucked behind a dry creek and half buried in scrub pine. No cell service, no neighbors, just one room, a cot, a stovetop, and a propane tank that I had to bang with a stick to get working some mornings. I liked the solitude, or at least I thought I did. Back then, I still believed I was in control of my space, my hours, my routine, before I realized someone else had already memorized every part of it. It was a Tuesday when I first saw him. The lunch rush had come and gone, and I was wiping down the counters while the last of the brisket sat under the warmer. The wind had picked up outside, making the tin walls creak. I remember glancing up when the bell over the door chimed. He looked completely unremarkable. Average height, sandy hair, faded jeans, and a green flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He didn't look like a trucker or a local. No dust on his boots. No touristy vibe either. He walked in slow, like he already knew the layout, and headed straight for the counter without glancing at the menu board. His eyes locked onto mine before I even greeted him, and I remember feeling this small prickle at the back of my neck. He smiled, not wide, just a twitch of his lips, like he knew something I didn't. "Pulled pork plate," he said, voice low and steady. "No slaw, extra pickles." I rang him up, tried to keep it polite. He leaned on the counter closer than most people do. Not in a flirty way, not aggressive, just close. Close enough that I caught the scent of something weirdly familiar on him, like my soap. When I handed him his receipt, he looked at my name tag, read it out loud. "Leah," he said, dragging it out like it tasted good. "That's a nice name. You always smell like coconut, or is that just today?" I didn't answer, just gave him a forced smile and called his number to the kitchen. He stepped back and stood near the cooler eyes, never leaving me. When his food was ready, he took the bag, nodded once, and walked out without another word. I thought maybe he was just some weirdo passing through. It happens when you work roadside. But something about the way he moved deliberate, like a man who had all the time in the world, stuck with me long after his truck pulled away down the gravel road. That night when I showered, I thought about his words again. Coconut. It was true. I had used that body wash that morning, but I hadn't mentioned it, and the scent was subtle. Too subtle for anyone to notice, unless they'd been standing very, very close, or unless they'd smelled it before. He came back 2 days later. Same time, same clothes, same smile. He ordered the same pulled pork plate, no slaw, extra pickles. This time, he added a drink. Sweet tea, no ice. He leaned forward again, just like before, and said, "Late night last night." I nodded, confused. "You look tired," he added, eyes flicking to the dark circles under mine. I forced a polite laugh, said something about not sleeping well. He nodded like he already knew. Then he said, "You should leave the light on when you're up that late. Bad idea being in the dark all alone out there." I paused, caught between being polite and backing away. "How do you know where I live?" I asked. The question came out sharper than I intended. His smile stayed fixed. "Small area," he said. "Not many cabins up that ridge. Hard to miss who comes and goes." That night, I locked the cabin door twice. I pulled the curtain tight and turned off every light before stepping into the shower. I don't know why I felt nervous, but I did. There was no window in the bathroom. But even so, I kept glancing over my shoulder while shampooing my hair. Afterward, I stood by the door with a knife from the kitchen and listened. Nothing but wind and the occasional creak of the trees outside. Still, I barely slept. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Not boot prints like mine. These were smaller, flatter. Sneakers, maybe. They led from the edge of the woods to my front step, stopped there, and turned back. My heart dropped when I noticed one of the cabin windows just slightly cracked open. I hadn't opened it, I was sure. I told myself it must have been the wind, that I was just being paranoid. But I started keeping a baseball bat beside the door. Over the next week, he came in 3 more times. Always the same food, always the same comments. "Vanilla today," he'd ask, switching it up. He started mentioning my schedule. "You open on Sundays too? Must be rough, no time to sleep in. Or I saw you driving down the ridge yesterday. That road's brutal after rain, isn't it?" I stopped answering. Just handed him his order and turned away. Each time he lingered a little longer. Each time he left without taking his eyes off me. One evening after he left, I went to lock the front door and saw something resting on the porch railing. A single bottle cap. From the brand of coconut water I'd bought that morning. I hadn't told anyone I liked it. I hadn't even thrown the bottle away yet. That night, I couldn't bring myself to shower. I sat on the edge of the cot in my cabin, holding the baseball bat and staring at the dark corners of the room. Every sound felt sharper. The creak of a tree branch outside made me flinch. I told myself I was being irrational, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had already crossed a line. I slept in Fitz's half-dressed light on bat within reach. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something under the floorboards. A dull creak, then nothing. Maybe it was the pipes or the old wood settling. I stayed frozen for 10 minutes, breathing slow, listening to silence that stretched far too long. The next morning, I called Big Red. I told him I was feeling sick and needed a couple days off. He didn't ask questions, just grunted and told me to rest. I spent the whole day combing through the cabin. I checked every lock, every window. I dragged furniture away from the walls. Nothing. Then I opened the crawlspace hatch under the rug. It hadn't been touched in years. Dust, cobwebs, old nails on the edges. I almost didn't look. Almost. But something made me shine the flashlight down anyway. At first I saw nothing but dirt and wood beams. Then I saw the indentation. There wasn't much. Just a flat, worn patch in the dirt just big enough for a man to lie down. Nearby scraps of cloth, a used napkin with a logo from Big Reds, and worst of all, a clear plastic water bottle with a straw sticking out. It had my name scrawled across the label in thick marker. Just Leah. That was the moment my stomach dropped. I realized this man hadn't just been watching me. He'd been living under me, listening to every movement, tracking my habits, timing when I cooked, when I left, when I showered. I backed away and slammed the hatch shut. I shoved a chair over it and ran outside, pacing in the dirt, trying not to scream. I called the sheriff's office from the old payphone near the trailhead, but they were slow to respond. They said someone would come by later that day. I couldn't wait. I packed a bag and decided to hike down the ridge to my cousin's place. I needed to get out, just a mile or two through the woods. Halfway down, I stopped at a stream to splash water on my face. I hadn't even realized how hard I was shaking. I knelt by the water, breathing deeply, and that's when I heard it. A twig snapping behind me. I turned. No one. But when I looked down again, my reflection wasn't alone. A second figure was behind me, standing still, watching. When I spun around, he was already moving fast, silent, cutting between the trees. He hadn't followed me. He had waited for me to run. I ran. I didn't think. My feet tore through brush and mud branches, slicing my arms as I stumbled through the trees. I didn't stop until I saw the rusted sign at the end of the trail, the one marking the start of my cousin's property. I collapsed on his porch, pounding on the door, until he came out half asleep and confused. I couldn't speak at first, just pointed back toward the woods, kept saying he was there. He was there. The sheriff didn't show up until hours later. When they finally searched the cabin, they found the crawl space exactly as I left it, except now the indentation was gone, smoothed over, like someone had brushed it clean. The bottle with my name on it, gone. But they did find a small knife tucked under my mattress and a pair of women's underwear that didn't belong to me. That was enough for them to take things seriously. They found a trail camera hidden in a tree near my window. It had been recording for weeks. Dozens of images. Me sleeping, me cooking, me stepping out of the shower. There were even shots of me brushing my hair at night through the gap in the curtains I hadn't realized was there. They traced the man's truck to a campsite near the back edge of the forest. He was gone by the time they got there, but his notebook was still inside. Pages and pages of notes about me. Times, smells, routines, even imagined conversations. Some pages were soaked through with water like he'd been crying on them. Or worse. I never went back to that cabin. I never even collected my last paycheck. I changed my number, moved 2 states away, and started using a different name at coffee shops. I still can't shower in silence. I need music playing, or I start to imagine that someone somewhere is counting down the seconds until I turn the water off. Story 2. The Crying Man at St. Ulric's Pass. I found the job on a bulletin board outside a gas station in northern Idaho. A paper flyer, half-ripped and sun-faded, pinned under layers of community announcements. It read, "Caretaker needed. Old chapel in St. Ulric's Pass. Room provided. Must be comfortable working alone at night." That last part should have made me hesitate. But I was broke 3 months behind on rent, and my car was on its last tank of gas. The address led me to a narrow dirt road that climbed through a dense pine forest until it opened into a small clearing. That was the first time I saw the chapel. White stone walls streaked with moss. Stained glass windows so dark with age they barely glinted in the light. A short bell tower missing its bell. The place looked forgotten. like it had slipped through the cracks of time. A man named Mr. Harrow met me at the front steps. 60s maybe. Wiry frame. Dressed like a park ranger. He didn't say much, just handed me a ring of keys and a binder full of instructions. I was to lock up the chapel at 7 each night. Walk the perimeter once every 2 hours. Report anything unusual in the morning logbook. The position was funded by some historical preservation trust. No guests, no services. Just keep the place clean and keep an eye out. The living quarters were in the back, a small loft above the sacristy. One bed, one window, one desk. No cell signal, no internet, no neighbors for miles. Just trees and fog and silence so thick it rang in my ears. That first night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, with the dark pressing against the glass, I told myself this was a fresh start. Peaceful. Simple. But I could already feel it, that quiet wasn't empty. It was waiting. It started with the mud. Just little clumps at first by the chapel's front door. I noticed it on my second night right after locking up. I had swept that area earlier, so I knew it was new. The weather had been dry for days, so there was no reason for mud to be tracked in. I figured maybe an animal had wandered through. A deer, maybe, or raccoon. But the footprints didn't match. They were long, narrow, almost human, but off in a way I couldn't place. I cleaned them up and didn't mention it in the logbook. Maybe I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe I didn't want to admit that something already felt wrong. By the fifth night, the footprints appeared again. This time inside. A thin trail leading from the main doors down the center aisle. They stopped at the fourth pew on the left. Just stopped. No return prints, no smear marks. I stood there staring at them longer than I should have. They were still damp, as if whatever left them had been there just moments before. I knelt to touch one and felt the chill rise through my fingers. The floor beneath it was ice cold. Then came the sound. It was close to midnight when I heard it for the first time, a low whimpering coming from somewhere near the altar. I turned off my flashlight and stood still in the dark. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like someone trying not to cry, muffled and trembling like sorrow barely held back. I crept closer, calling out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" The sound stopped. I stood alone at the front of the chapel, the air heavy and unmoving. I checked every door, every corner, even the old confessionals. Nothing. When I returned to the loft, I noticed something chilling. The window facing the front yard was fogged over from the outside, and in the center of the glass, just at eye level, was a faint smear. 5 long streaks, like someone had pressed their fingers to the glass and dragged them downward slowly. There was no ladder, no overhang, just open air. And yet something had stood there close enough to cry and watch. The next morning, I walked the perimeter again in full daylight, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. The window streaks were gone, burned away by the rising sun, or maybe just imagined altogether. I wanted to write it off as nerves. I was still adjusting to the silence out here, to the way the trees swallowed sound and the chapel seemed to breathe with the weather. But when I unlocked the front doors, the muddy footprints were back. A new set leading once again to the fourth pew on the left. Same shape, same eerie precision, like someone walking with one leg dragging behind. I stood there staring at them, feeling the skin at the back of my neck pull tight. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't the wind. Something was coming inside. That afternoon, I asked Mr. Harrow if there were any records about the chapel. He looked surprised, but not alarmed. "Everything's in the archives," he said. "Basement level. old storage room near the boiler. The door hadn't been opened in years. I had to force the lock. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and mildew. Rows of shelves stacked with water-stained boxes. Baptism records, marriage licenses, ledger books dating back to the 1920s. I sifted through anything that seemed out of place. Finally, in a dusty black folder, I found a collection of handwritten pages with dates and notes. No official titles, just names, locations, and the occasional scrawled phrase. One name appeared again and again: Thomas LeClaire. The notes said he was a groundskeeper back in 1964. His handwriting filled 3 pages records of odd happenings. Footprints, crying, doors found open after being locked. The same 4th pew on the left always disturbed. Then the notes changed. Thomas became obsessed. His writing grew frantic. One page was filled with a single sentence written over and over: "He is still mourning. He is still mourning." I dug deeper and found an obituary. A man named Elias Durant, aged 29, had died inside the chapel during a winter storm in 1959. Froze to death in the front pew. His body wasn't discovered for 2 days. No family claimed him. Buried behind the chapel in an unmarked grave. I went out to the rear yard that evening, pushing through knee-high weeds and collapsed headstones until I found a single stone sunken into the earth. No name, just a date. February 1959. That night, I lit a candle and placed it in the 4th pew. I sat 3 rows behind, watching, waiting. Around midnight, I heard the soft sound again. A low, broken sob. This time it wasn't distant. It was right there. The candle flame bent as if something passed near. I didn't run. I whispered "Elias," and the sobbing stopped. In its place, a breathless silence. Then from just beside me, so close, I felt it on my ear, another breath. Not mine. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked as that breath slid across my ear. It was warm, damp, and horribly real. My heart thundered against my ribs, screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Not yet. The pew in front of me creaked, as though someone had just sat down. I looked slowly, candlelight flickering against the old wood. No one was visible. And yet something had changed in the air, heavier now, like the chapel itself was holding its breath. Then just above the whisper of the wind outside, I heard it again. A quiet sob, fragile and human. Except it wasn't coming from the front of the church this time. It was to my right, beside me, just out of reach. I turned slowly, scanning the aisle. There was no one there, but my candle flame shuddered violently. Then I saw it. A figure tall and impossibly thin stepped out from between 2 pillars near the altar. It didn't walk so much as drift, each movement pulling too far joints, bending too long, like a puppet handled by invisible strings. Its head tilted to one side in a way that was almost curious, almost childlike. And then it began to weep. Not loudly, but constantly, like grief had carved itself into its throat and never left. As it moved down the aisle, I noticed its face, or what should have been a face. The features were sunken, blurred, like melting wax. No eyes that I could see, just hollow impressions. But somehow I still felt watched, judged, wanted. It stopped at the 4th pew, exactly where Elias had died. Slowly, painfully it sat. The wood groaned beneath it, and though the seat remained visibly empty, the indent was there, forming against the old cushion. The crying deepened, wet and gasping, as if each breath was an apology that never came. I whispered again, "Elias, is that you?" And the crying stopped. It turned its head. Not a quick motion, but gradual, steady, like it had been waiting for me to ask. I don't know what I expected. Relief, maybe. Recognition. What I got was something colder. It opened its mouth not to speak, but to release a sound like wind through a hollow tunnel, like every word it had ever tried to say had been swallowed by the walls of this place. The scent of damp earth filled the air. The floor beneath my feet grew colder. The candle snuffed out. In that moment of darkness, I heard movement again. Behind me, multiple footsteps, dragging wet. More than one. I shot to my feet and backed away, my breath coming fast. When I turned to the entrance, I saw shadows moving between the pews, flickering like they were being pulled toward the altar. I bolted through the sacristy and didn't stop running until I was in the loft, the door locked behind me, the windows covered. And still in the distance, muffled by walls and wood, I heard them crying. Not just one. Now there were many. As if Elias had been waiting for someone to listen, and now he wasn't alone anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright in the loft, back pressed to the far wall flashlight in one hand, and the binder of instructions in the other, though it offered nothing that could explain what I had seen. I kept the window covered and didn't dare look outside. The crying eventually stopped sometime around dawn, but the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It felt more like a truce, like the chapel had allowed me one night to bear witness, and now it was deciding what to do with me. When Mr. Harrow arrived later that morning, I expected him to ask questions. Instead, he just looked at me, really looked and said, "You heard them, didn't you?" I nodded. My mouth was too dry to speak. He didn't seem surprised, just tired. He told me I could leave if I wanted, that no one would blame me. But then he added something else, something that still unsettles me. They cry less when someone's here, he said. And when no one is, they move. I stayed. Not because I was brave, but because I needed the money. And maybe part of me felt like I owed Elias that much. Each night, I lit a candle and placed it in the fourth pew. I sat a few rows back and listened. Sometimes the crying came. Sometimes it didn't. But I always felt the weight of unseen eyes. Over time, I learned the rules. Never speak twice. Never light more than one candle. Never stay past 3 in the morning. And always leave the door unlocked when I go to bed. Because whatever grief lives inside St. Ulric's Pass doesn't want to be trapped. It just wants to be remembered. And some nights when I hear them weeping beneath the floor, I think that's all any of us want. Story 3. Cabin 14. Doesn't want to be empty. The camp always felt different before the kids arrived. Quieter. Still. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. I'd worked 5 summers at Camp Morrow Ridge high in the Colorado backcountry, and every May a few of us returned early to prep the grounds, clean the cabins, stock the pantry, run safety checks on the lake docks and trails. It was the kind of routine work that gave you time to think. This year I arrived with a small crew, just 4 of us, 2 new maintenance guys, an old friend of mine named Clara, who ran the crafts lodge, and me, Diego, head counselor. We arrived on a Monday morning just after the last snow had melted from the shaded gullies. The dirt road in was still soft in places, and one of the trucks got stuck near the ranger gate. Once we unpacked, we divvied up the cabins. Everyone got 2 to clean and inspect. Mine were cabins 13 and 14. They sat farther back than the others past the mess hall and close to the tree line. That didn't bother me. I liked the quiet, the distance. Cabin 13 was exactly what I expected. Dusty bunks, dead spiders, 1 cracked window, easy fixes. I swept and aired it out without thinking twice. Cabin 14. Though there was something off even before I opened the door. The steps creaked too softly under my boots. The air felt heavier, like the trees around it were watching. When I placed my hand on the knob, it was already warm, though the sun hadn't reached this side of camp yet. I stood there for a moment listening. No birds, no squirrels, just silence. I told myself it was nothing. A cabin is just wood and nails. But something in the way that door eased open told me this one remembered being lived in. And it didn't like being empty. Inside the cabin was almost too clean. No dust on the windowsills, no cobwebs in the corners. The air didn't carry that sharp mix of mildew and mouse droppings like the others had. Instead, it smelled faintly sweet, like dried lavender, and something warmer, like old cologne. The kind you'd find in a grandfather's closet. I walked slowly, unsure of why I felt so cautious. The beds were all neatly made, which was strange, because we always stripped them at the end of every season. Even stranger, the farthest bunk in the right-hand corner had a pillow that looked freshly fluffed. The blanket on top was folded with perfect corners, the kind of fold only someone with time and care would bother with. I checked the closet. Empty. I lifted the mattresses one by one. Nothing underneath. But the back window was latched from the inside with a small wooden peg, a style we hadn't used in years. Someone had replaced it, and recently too. The wood was a slightly different color, not yet darkened by weather or age. I jotted it down in my clipboard report, but didn't mention the blanket. Something about it felt personal. Like reporting it would betray the quiet order that lived inside this cabin. I moved to the small shelf above the doorframe where campers often left their junk old comics, friendship bracelets, carved sticks. This shelf was empty except for a single paper crane, white crisp, folded with precision. I stared at it for a long moment before placing it gently back where I found it. The longer I stayed inside, the more the space felt occupied. Not messy, not ruined, just subtly lived in, like someone had stepped out for lunch and would be back soon. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the narrow mirror above the sink. For a split second, I thought there was someone standing behind me. Not moving, just watching. But when I spun around the room, it was still. Sunlight filtered through the window, now casting long shadows on the floorboards. One of them stretched from the far bunk to the center of the room, but the bed itself was untouched by light, like it absorbed it instead of reflecting it. I left the door propped open as I stepped outside and wrote 3 words in the margin of my checklist. Do not assign. Then I walked away and told myself I was just being dramatic. It was just a cabin, an empty, silent cabin at the edge of camp, one that felt too ready to be used again. That night after dinner, Clara and I sat by the fire pit outside the main lodge. The maintenance guys had already turned in, but I couldn't shake the feeling Cabin 14 had left with me. I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see movement. Clara noticed. She asked which cabins I'd been working on, and when I said 14, her expression changed. Subtle, but there. You felt it too, didn't you? She asked, quietly, stirring the ashes with a stick. I didn't answer at first. She went on. I've been coming here since I was 12. The cabin's always had something. My first year as a camper, we weren't even allowed near it. I looked at her. Why, she hesitated, then leaned in slightly, voice lower. There was a girl, summer of 2007. I wasn't in that session, but the story stuck around. The camper went missing. 10 years old. Quiet. Barely talked to anyone. She was staying in cabin 14 with 7 other girls. They woke up one morning and she was gone. No signs of forced entry. No open windows. Just gone. They searched the entire woods for 3 days. Dogs, helicopters, everything. I swallowed hard. Did they find her? Clara nodded slowly. Yeah. That's the weird part. Day 4, she was back, curled up on her bunk like nothing happened, still in her camp clothes, wet like she'd been in the lake, even though the weather had been bone dry for days. She didn't say a word, not to anyone. Her parents pulled her out that night. Word got around. The camp cleaned out the cabin and stopped using it for a couple of seasons. I looked toward the tree line again. The outline of cabin 14 was barely visible, shadowed in pine. Clara added, "They say she whispered one thing to a counselor while they were packing her bags. Just 4 words. She wouldn't let me. I didn't ask who she was. I didn't want to know. But suddenly, that perfectly folded blanket, that faint smell of lavender, it all felt like something that hadn't been left behind, but something that had remained. Cabin 14 wasn't empty. It was waiting. And it had already chosen once before. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow across the bunk, the blanket folded too perfectly, the girl curled up and soaked to the bone. Around 2 in the morning, I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked the camp trails just to clear my head. I told myself it wasn't about cabin 14, but my feet still took me there. The air was colder near the cabin, and the kind of cold that doesn't come from altitude or wind, but from something deeper, older. I stood at the edge of the porch, flashlight in hand, and listened. No night birds, no breeze, just stillness. I don't know what I expected to see, but everything looked the same. The door was closed now. I knew I'd left it propped open earlier, but maybe one of the maintenance guys had closed it. Or maybe not. I stepped up and tried the knob. It turned easily. The door creaked open, slow and deliberate. Inside, the air was warmer than outside. Not just warm, humid. It felt like walking into a room where someone had been breathing deeply for hours. The flashlight caught the edges of the bunk beds, the corner shelves, the paper crane still untouched on its perch. Everything looked normal. Until I saw the bed. The one in the far corner, the one with the blanket folded neatly earlier that day, was different now. The blanket had been turned down like someone was inviting themselves in. A small indentation pressed into the pillow, shaped like the weight of a head. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I stepped closer. And then I heard it. The soft creak of footsteps, but not mine. Slow and deliberate, coming from the ceiling above. I looked up. There was no second floor, just the exposed beams of the roof. The sound moved one slow step, then another. I backed away, heart hammering, and that's when I saw it. The mirror above the sink. My reflection was there, but behind me was another shape. A figure standing just inside the doorway, unmoving. I spun around, no one there. The door was open, windlass empty. I turned back. The reflection was gone. I didn't run. I walked slow and steady down the porch steps and back to the main lodge. My mind raced. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe leftover nerves from Clara's story. But when I returned the next morning with Clara and one of the maintenance guys, the bed was made again. Perfect corners, pillows centered, and the paper crane. It was gone. In its place, a fresh one. Pale blue, folded from a newer sheet of paper, no dust on it at all. We didn't speak a word. Just closed the door and marked the cabin as off limits. Later that night, I sat by the fire alone, thinking about that bunk, that bed, that mirror. The girl who vanished. The whisperer. She wouldn't let me. Cabin 14 had been empty too long, and something in it had finally noticed. Not just that I'd been inside, but that I'd seen it, and worse, that I'd remembered. We finished our prep week without ever speaking of cabin 14 again. It stayed closed, its name quietly removed from the summer rosters. The new maintenance guys didn't ask questions. Clara avoided the trail that led past it, and I made sure to never walk that far alone again. On the final day, just before the first group of campers arrived, I went back one last time. Not out of courage, out of responsibility. I needed to make sure it was still sealed, still undisturbed. The door was locked. The windows were closed. But something had changed. A faint sound, barely audible, unless you were standing on the porch, like breathing deep and even coming from inside. I didn't open the door. I didn't knock. I left a note taped to the frame in bold marker, "Do not enter." Then I walked away. That summer cabin for Ititina stayed untouched, but stories still spread. Campers claimed they heard footsteps on the gravel when no one was near. One kid said he saw a woman watching from the trees. Another swore they saw a light flicker behind the cabin blinds, though no one had gone in. By August, even the new staff avoided the back end of camp. Before I left in September, I rewrote the checklist sheet for incoming counselors. I added a line at the very bottom in red ink. Cabin 14 is not for campers. It is not for staff. If you hear anything, don't investigate. If you see the door open, do not go inside. And if the bed is made when it should not be closed, the door, walk away and say nothing. Because there are places that were never meant to be empty. And some rooms only stay quiet as long as they're respected. Cabin 14 remembers, and it does not like being forgotten. Story 4. The Listener with No Eyes. I moved to the mountains to disappear, not in the dramatic sense. I wasn't running from the law or anything like that. But after 15 years of recording voiceovers and running a mid-sized horror podcast, I was tired. Tired of constantly being online. Tired of parasocial relationships. Tired of strangers thinking they knew me because they heard my voice 5 nights a week. When the harassment started, emails, messages, fake accounts commenting on old posts, I tried to ignore it. When it escalated into threats, I deleted everything. My podcast, my Twitter, my subreddit. All of it gone in one night. Then I packed my life into 2 duffel bags and left Portland for a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains that had no signal, no neighbors, and no way for anyone to casually drop by. The cabin was small and old, but solid. Wood stove in the corner. 1 bedroom. A wraparound porch that overlooked nothing but trees. I bought a wind-up radio and a generator for the essentials. I brought books, notebooks, and my old condenser mic, not to record, just to feel grounded. That first week was bliss. I walked the trails, cooked slow meals, read in silence. At night, I sat on the porch and listened to the forest. Crickets, wind, the occasional owl. No voices, no notifications, no pressure to be interesting. For the first time in years, I felt like I existed just for myself. My thoughts were my own again. My head was quiet. But it didn't last. Around the end of week 2, I started noticing strange sounds just outside the edge of the woods. Not animals, not branches, just the faintest hint of breath, like someone exhaling through their nose. Listening, always listening, and never blinking. At first, I thought it was in my head. After so many years plugged in, maybe my brain was just reaching for the familiar. I ignored the sounds for days, that soft exhale beyond the trees, the subtle creak on the porch when no one was there. I even laughed it off once, saying aloud, "Too much horror fiction, Caleb," as I stirred soup on the stove. But then the letters started. They weren't delivered. They just appeared. Folded sheets of notebook paper slipped under the door in the night, always with the same handwriting. Neat, deliberate, and always referring to things I had only thought, never said. The first one read, "You like the silence. It does not like you." I stood on the porch for a long time that morning, scanning the woods, waiting for someone to step out and reveal the prank. But the trees just swayed quietly, unmoved by any presence. The second note came 2 nights later. I had sat by the fireplace thinking about my mother, how I hadn't called her since before I left. I never said it out loud. But the note read, "You are not a good son. You feel it now, even here." My stomach dropped when I read that. I hadn't told anyone where I went. No social media, no trail, and no one had been in the cabin but me. Then came the whispers. Not full voices, just fragments. Words I had almost thought, half-formed fears. They slipped under the edge of my awareness late at night. Regret, alone, seen. I would freeze unsure if I had imagined them. But every time I opened the door and stepped outside, the air felt colder than it should. Still, dense, like it was holding its breath. Like something just beyond the trees had been leaning in, catching every unspoken word. I started sleeping with the radio on, not for music, just for sound, something to drown out whatever else might be listening. But it didn't help. Because now, even through static, I could sometimes hear it. My own voice, repeating my own thoughts back to me, only just a second too late. I stopped trusting my own thoughts. They no longer felt private. Every time I sat quietly with my mind trying to read or write or simply exist, I felt a presence brushing just beneath the surface of my consciousness, like a second pair of hands thumbing through my memories. It wasn't just the letters anymore. Now it was footsteps in the dirt that never led anywhere. Now it was the sensation of breath on the back of my neck when I was alone at my desk. Now it was the dreams. They started out vague. A dark figure watching me from the woods. No eyes, just smooth, pale skin where its face should have been. But the dreams evolved, becoming more intimate. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was mouthing my words as I spoke them, repeating my thoughts as I dreamed them. One night I woke to find the paper notebook I kept by my bedside, flipped open pages filled with sentences I didn't remember writing. Pages upon pages of the same phrase in my handwriting, "It knows you now. It will not forget." The worst part wasn't fear. It was familiarity. Like I had always known something would eventually come for me. Not to hurt me, just to know me completely. To reach into my mind and live in the quiet parts I thought were mine alone. I began to doubt my memory, my reality. I would set down my coffee mug only to find it already in the sink. I would open the fridge to find things I didn't buy arranged in patterns I didn't make. I tried calling my sister from the landline just to ground myself in something real, but the line clicked before it could ring. Then I heard my own voice say through the static, "You miss her, but you didn't leave for her. You left for you, and now you're alone." I stopped using mirrors. Every time I looked into one, I half expected to see something behind me. And worse, I began to catch myself hesitating before thinking anything private. As if I needed permission. As if I were afraid something else might be listening. The boundaries between my thoughts and the space around me were thinning. One night, I screamed. Not from terror, from desperation. I screamed into the woods just to hear something that wasn't my own voice. But the echo came back wrong. It didn't bounce off the trees. It answered. Same tone, same pitch, same words, but half a breath too late. Like something had listened, considered, and then said it for me. I decided to leave. That was the only plan I had left. The next morning, I packed a small bag, took what little cash I'd stashed in a coffee tin, and locked the cabin door behind me without looking back. The problem was the road that had brought me in was no longer the same. Trees leaned in at unnatural angles. Landmarks I remembered were gone or changed. The old ranger sign was split in half and covered in moss. I knew it had not been there 2 weeks ago. It was like the forest had rewritten itself while I wasn't watching. Or worse, it had always been this way, and I had only just started to see it for what it was. I walked for hours, then lost track of time altogether. Every path I took curved somehow back toward the cabin. No matter how long I hiked, the light never changed. It stayed dim like dusk, trapped beneath thick cloud. The woods were dead silent. No wind, no birds, no light. Just the steady presence of something walking parallel to me in the trees. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Every time I paused, it paused. Every time I moved again, I heard the faintest crunch of soil somewhere just out of sight. It wasn't stalking me. It was pacing me, waiting. Eventually I gave up. My legs were shaking, my throat dry. I turned back and found the cabin door open, even though I was certain I'd locked it. The inside smelled wrong. Not foul, but old. Like forgotten cloth and wet stone. I stepped in and found the table rearranged. My old condenser mic, the one I hadn't used in months, was now centered cable plugged and light blinking. My voice recorder lay open beside it, a fresh tape already rolling. I picked it up, hand trembling. It was recording silence. At least I thought it was. Then, without pressing anything, the tape played back. Not my voice. Not exactly. It was me, yes. But it was a thought I had just had, seconds ago. A line I'd silently rehearsed in my mind. "What do you want from me?" the voice whispered. Identical, word for word. Then came another voice, quieter, fainter, layered beneath mine. It said, "We only want what you are willing to give. We want your silence." I backed away, knocking over the chair. The walls seemed to lean inward. Shadows stretched. The forest outside had grown darker, thicker, pressing against the windows. The presence was no longer outside. It was here. Not as a shape, but as a pressure in the air, a density of attention. I looked toward the back hallway and saw nothing but felt it watching from a place where sight was no longer needed. I screamed again this time, not into the woods, but into the house. I shouted every private thought I could think of, words I had never told anyone. And the voice repeated them back, slowly, tenderly, like someone reading from a favorite book. My thoughts were no longer mine. They had never been. I understood then. The listener didn't come from my body. It came from my mind, and it had been there patiently long before I noticed. I left everything behind. I didn't bother packing again. I just ran. Out the door, through the trees, down the slope, until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. I didn't care where I ended up. I only needed to get away from the cabin, away from the voice, away from the thing that wore my thoughts like a second skin. I don't remember how long I ran. I must have blacked out at some point, because when I came to, I was lying beside an old logging road with sunlight cutting through the canopy. Real sunlight. Morning. I hadn't seen real morning light in days. A ranger found me wandering a few hours later. I told him I'd gotten lost hiking. He asked where I was staying, and I gave him a name I made up on the spot. He didn't question it, just offered me water and a ride to the nearest town. I haven't gone back. Not to the cabin, not to the podcast, not to any of it. I threw out my recording equipment. I changed my name on everything. I haven't posted a single word online in over a year, not even a comment. I don't keep journals. I don't speak aloud unless I have to. Because even now, when I sit in silence too long, I feel that old heaviness return. Sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I hear my voice whisper something I haven't said, a thought I hadn't yet formed, It's always kind, gentle, familiar. And that's what terrifies me the most. The listener doesn't scream. It never chased. It simply waited. And now that it has touched my mind, it knows where to find me. I am never truly alone, and I am never truly silent. Story 5. She wasn't on the map. I needed to get away from everything. The noise, the pitying looks, the endless texts asking if I was okay. After the breakup, I packed my hiking pack, turned off my phone, and drove north into the Cascades. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. That was the point. I wanted to feel small again, to let the trees and the wind and the quiet trail shrink my problems until they disappeared. I chose a route I had read about online, an old Forest Service loop near the base of Mount Garver, mostly abandoned after a few washouts years ago. The blog posts said it was challenging but beautiful, full of alpine meadows and glacier-fed creeks. What no one mentioned was how empty it felt. By day 2, I hadn't seen another hiker. Not a footprint, not a discarded wrapper. The trail was overgrown in spots, the signs faded or missing entirely. But I liked it that way. I set up camp beside a narrow stream that night, cooked instant noodles on my stove, and sat in silence beneath a sky thick with stars. It was the first time in months I felt peace. The next morning, I took a side trail that wasn't marked on my map. It was narrow, barely more than a deer path, but something about it pulled at me. The air felt different along that trail. Cooler, heavier, like I had stepped into a place that didn't want to be known. A few hundred yards in, I saw something through the trees. A cabin, old, weathered, tucked into a clearing, surrounded by ferns and wildflowers. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied. It had no visible road or path leading in. And yet the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting. I should have turned back. But instead I stepped closer. The cabin looked like it had been built a century ago and left to the moss and rot. Its roof sagged in the middle, covered in pine needles. The wood siding had turned gray, and vines crawled up the corners like veins. But there was no dust on the porch. No leaves, no signs of animals. Just a smooth path through the grass, leading up to the steps, like someone had been walking it daily. My boots creaked against the wood as I climbed the steps. The door, slightly open, gave with the lightest push. Inside, the air was dry and oddly sweet, like old cedar and dried herbs. The light filtering through the slats caught floating dust that didn't seem to settle. The cabin was one room, a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 wooden chairs, a bed in the corner with a neatly folded quilt. On the wall above the bed, someone had pinned a row of drawings, childlike sketches done in colored pencil. Trees, a woman with long black hair, a red circle that appeared in every drawing, sometimes in the sky, sometimes behind the woman. I stepped further in, noticed something that made my stomach drop. The kettle on the stove was still warm, not hot, but not cold either. I hadn't passed anyone on the trail. There was no car, no tracks, no other gear. I turned to leave, but before I could reach the door, I heard a soft laugh. A child's laugh echoing faintly from behind the cabin. I stepped outside and scanned the clearing. At the edge of the trees, just past the line of ferns, stood a girl in a red coat. She didn't move, just watched me. Her black hair hung over her face, and her hands were clasped in front of her like she was waiting. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say a word, she turned and walked into the woods. Not running, not scared, just slowly, as if expecting me to follow. I didn't. Not then. But the image of her stayed with me all day. And that night, I dreamed of her standing at the foot of my sleeping bag, whispering a song I couldn't understand. I woke up the next morning drenched in sweat, heart pounding like I'd been running for hours. The fire I'd built the night before was out just ash and damp wood. But the weirdest part was my watch. It blinked 12 noon, even though the sun had barely crested the ridge. I reset it, thinking the battery must have glitched. But as I packed up, something felt off. My sleeping bag was zipped differently than I usually left it. My boots, which I always lined up neatly, were turned inward like someone had stepped out of them facing me. I told myself I was imagining things, that the dream had just gotten into my head. I hiked out in the same direction I'd come from. I should have been back on the main trail within an hour. 2 hours later, I passed the same bend in the creek I had crossed the previous afternoon. The same downed birch tree with the fungus shelf. I thought maybe I'd taken the wrong branch of the trail, so I turned back, retraced my steps, and followed a new direction. This time, I ended up at the cabin again. It sat there in the clearing exactly as before, door ajar. Smoke lightly rising from the chimney now, though I had never seen anyone light it. I circled the perimeter, slowly calling out. No answer. But in the grass, I noticed something chilling. My own boot prints, faded versions from yesterday, looped in and out of the clearing, leading to where I stood now. I followed one of the trails into the woods and found it doubled back on itself within minutes, bringing me back to the cabin again, like the forest had closed in while I slept. I checked my phone even though I knew there was no signal. The screen lit up for a moment, then went black. In the brief flash, I saw the time. 5:12 p.m. My watch still said 10:41 a.m. I had lost hours, maybe more. That night, I lit a fire and forced myself to stay awake. Around midnight, I began hearing humming, a tune I didn't recognize drifting from the woods like wind chimes underwater. I stood at the edge of the tree-lined flashlight, raised heart pounding. And then she appeared again, the girl in the red coat. Closer this time. She didn't speak, just raised one hand and pointed to the sky. I looked up and saw nothing but stars, millions of them. But when I looked back down, she was gone. I turned slowly and realized I was no longer at my camp. I was back inside the cabin. No memory of walking. Fire still burning in the hearth. And my bag untouched, resting beside the bed. My legs shook beneath me. I didn't know how long I'd been here. I didn't know if I had ever truly left. And I finally understood that this place didn't want to be found on a map. It wanted to be remembered by anyone foolish enough to keep looking. I stopped trying to figure out how long I had been there. Time had lost its meaning. My watch reset itself every few hours. My phone would flicker on, only to display nonsense characters, and the sky never looked quite right. The stars above the cabin were too bright, too still, and sometimes they shimmered in colors I didn't recognize. Every path I took led me back to the same clearing, the same porch, the same girl in red, waiting at the tree line. Sometimes she stood with her head tilted. Sometimes she hummed. And sometimes I could swear she was mouthing my own thoughts before I could speak them. But the worst moment came when I looked into the cabin's mirror. I hadn't touched it before. I hadn't needed to. But that day, I felt compelled. My reflection was wrong. It was me, yes, but tired, pale eyes, sunken like I hadn't slept in weeks. And when I turned away from the mirror, I caught something on my arm, a mark I hadn't noticed before. A series of small, dark notches carved into my skin just below the elbow. 4 of them, straight and deliberate, like tallies. When I rolled up my sleeve, I found more. 12 in total. I hadn't put them there. I hadn't even felt them being made. Panic took over. I tore through my pack searching for a pen and started writing directly on my skin. The date, my name, the phrase I was here. I kept the pen in my pocket, and every hour I made a new mark. I watched to see if the tallies moved. They didn't. But one night I woke up to find a fresh mark on my neck. Not ink, cut. I knew then I had to get out. I stopped using the paths. I moved through the brush, uphill, downhill, across rivers, crawling if I had to. I didn't sleep. I didn't stop. I just kept repeating the same words in my head. This place is not mine. This time is not mine. And finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I broke through the trees and found a road. A car passed within minutes. The driver said I looked like I hadn't eaten in days. I had no idea if he was right. All I knew was that I was out. For now. They checked me into a hospital in a small mountain town 3 counties south. I gave them a fake name, told them I'd gotten lost hiking and survived on creek water and ration bars. They believed me, or maybe they just didn't care to ask more. I stayed for 2 nights under observation. They ran blood tests, monitored my sleep, gave me clothes that didn't feel like mine. When I looked in the mirror there, I almost didn't recognize myself. My skin was pale, my eyes hollow, and yet there was something else. A tension behind my eyes, like my thoughts weren't entirely private anymore. I asked one of the nurses if they had maps of the area. I pointed to where I thought the trail had been. The nurse brought me a laminated Forest Service map and unfolded it carefully on the table. I scanned every inch of it, traced every trail. The route I had taken was there, but the clearing, the offshoot, the cabin, nothing. Just a dense section of unmarked forest. When I asked about old ranger stations or historic cabins, she shook her head and said nothing like that had been active in decades. Before I left, I went to the restroom and rolled up my sleeve. The marks on my arm were fading, but they were still there, barely raised, almost like scars. But the one on my neck had vanished, as if it had never been made by any hand at all. Sometimes I dream about the girl in the red coat. She never speaks, but she stands at the edge of whatever place I'm in, watching, waiting. I've started carrying a pen again just in case, because I don't trust time the way I used to. And some part of me knows that the forest didn't let me go. It just let me leave long enough to wonder when it'll call me back. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.